I found with depression, one of the most important things you can realize is that you are not alone. You are not the first to go through it. You're not going to be the last to go through it. Dwayne Johnson, The Rock. Hi there. My name is Sean. Welcome to Stoic Mind, Noble Heart. I was looking on the internet, Stoicism, and started thinking a lot about mental health, and there's not a lot of people out there that are actually talking about mental health directly. And the videos I did find, they're very dry, or there's some stereotypical social worker named Karen with the credibility of a goldfish who looks like she's never had a bad day in her life, or is got all the clinical terms, but maybe not any of the actual experience of going through any kind of mental health. Somewhere 1 in 5 people, 18% of North Americans, suffer from mental illness. Yet, most people don't understand what mental illness even is. Most people have heard of depression, eating disorders, anxiety, post-traumatic stress syndrome, but most of them view it in a black and white kind of terms. You are either crazy or you're sane. It just simply isn't true. There's a huge spectrum, and it is complex as each individual. For the most part, it goes unnoticed and is invisible within society. You have no idea what somebody is going through. The last person you talked to and asked, "Hey, how you doing?" and they replied, "Oh, I'm fine," or "Okay, I'm okay." They could be suffering, silent, and you wouldn't even know it. I'm mostly going to talk about PTSD because I have some military background, and it's what I'm most familiar with. I also think it's a good place to start. It seems to be one of the forerunners in opening up the idea in society you can have mental damage, and it is actually a real thing. Throughout history, if you had mental illnesses or mental disorders, we're talking in the Middle Ages, all the way up to probably the 19th century, you were simply just a coward, or you're crazy, or you're possessed by the devil. What we today call PTSD. The first diagnosed were in the Crimean War, and probably more famously during the American Civil War, where they coined the phrase irritable heart syndrome. Basically, this was the first time they'd recognized soldiers who had been in combat were not physically hurt, did not have wounds, physical wounds, but were unable to function, and they became quite despondent, unmotivated, and fatigued, and unable to perform normal duties. And this was the first time, I think, ever that they kind of recognized it as something that it wasn't just these soldiers acting cowardly. They started to kind of treat it a little bit differently than they would in the past. However, the diagnosis never really led to any tangible cures. All it did was just give the doctors a reason and a way of labeling this phenomenon. This went on for about 40 or 50 years after the American Civil War. But the next major surge we seen was a terminology called shell shock during the First World War. Now, anybody who's studied the First World War has seen pictures of this trench warfare where soldiers would spend weeks at a time stuck in this situation where they were being constantly bombarded. They were unable to move the dead, so they're surrounded by their own dead. There's constant rain in some places, and these holes would just fill up with mud and water. They'd be gassed, so the water would be surrounding them, living terrible conditions where now they have dead bodies and mud that is filled with toxic chemicals and constant bombardment. This is the first time in warfare they started to realize that even the toughest men cannot sustain this kind of mental terror for long periods of time. So they started to actually have to manage how they dealt with all this. They started to rotate men out, get them away from the front line, and they found that after some time away from the front line, they would start to come around and maybe not return to normal, but be able to function as soldiers again. So they actually recognized the fatigue within the soldiers, and they realized that they would have to manage and deal with the illness and not just let it manifest and then walk away. So they started to kind of come up with some sort of prognosis and diagnosis of the situation. We compare the mental stress and the fatigue in World War II. A a lot of the battles were quite different, but some of the battles in World War II are the bloodiest and most horrifying battles we've ever seen in human history. Again, some of these men exposed to these battles, not necessarily on a daily basis, but in consistency over a year, 2 years. Some of these Europeans, 3, 4 years, were going through these battles. When they returned home, I think we call them the greatest generation, is all these veterans that came back from the Second World War. They started to have to self-medicate. I think of my own grandfather in the Second World War. He was a gunner, navigator in a Lancaster, and I think some of the stuff that he'd seen over there, even just the damage and the trauma of being exposed to this constant warfare, definitely affected him. And he was for sure an alcoholic, and something that, he managed. These guys, they lived the rest of their lives, but I think you talk to any of these veterans and they're broken souls. I've had a privilege of talking to many of them over my career in the military. It was considered kind of your duty as a young private to go up and talk to these veterans during Remembrance Day and learn about some of their stories, and you get a reverence of what they went through, but you also start to understand that these kind of battles and these kind of things that these people seen definitely affect them. And even myself, as talking about PTSD, you come back from operations, and even in the late 90s, early 2000s, the programs they had didn't necessarily address these issues. It wasn't until just recently, in the last 10, 15 years, 20 years, that they really started to understand PTSD and ways of handling it, and things to do to make it better for these soldiers. Today, the stigma is starting to erode away, but I think the stigma is still there quite heavily. A lot of times we address these mental illnesses and mental disorders in a very trivial way when we say things like, she is bipolar because she gets upset about every little thing, or I'm so OCD about when it comes to my underwear drawer, I like to have that really organized. Use the terminologies in a very non-clinical way is not very helpful. Thinking into the future, 30, 40, 50 years from now, I think that we're really going to understand and have the diagnostic tools to understand mental disorders so much better. One way that gives me hope is I took a look at a picture from the turn of the century of some workers at the Empire States Building, and they're having lunch on this beam looking out over the city, not a care in the world, no safety equipment, no hard hats, no gloves. And I think about myself, I work in an industry that personal protective equipment is not only encouraged, but is mandatory, and it's very strict regulation. So anybody who's ever worked in modern construction realizes how crazy it would be just to sit on a beam like that. I mean, that's how they understood it, and that's the standard of the day. I take a look at that, we understand this. Hurting ourselves physically can be protected with our personal protective equipment and PPE. In 30 or 40 years, I think we're going to get as good at diagnosing and understanding mental illness in the same way. It's going to look as silly now, the way we treat mental illness, as this picture of these men sitting on this beam. How easily it should have been to be able to diagnose and treat these and prevent mental disorders compared to how we treat it nowadays. One way I've been shown to look at your mental health is the meter goes from green to yellow to red to black. Green being okay, yellow being highly stressed, red, you're having a breakdown, black, you're completely unable to function. And I think most people function somewhere in the green range, maybe in the high dark green range. Yellow is just day-to-day life, and they're able to kind of manage their mental health. You start getting into the yellow, you take some stress leave, you take some time off, you start a hobby, you exercise, you start eating better, maybe go on vacation, deal with the issues yourself. However, if you have a mental illness, you can't just get better. You can't just leave the yellow. You get stuck in that yellow for long enough, it gets harder and harder to be able to get out. You could just say, oh, why don't you just get better? Why don't you just make yourself better? It's as ridiculous as somebody who has a heart attack or a stroke. The next day you say, well, just make yourself better. Here, eat a salad, you're going to be better, and then expect them to be better the next day. What it takes is specific tools, techniques, and diagnosis to be able to help make things better. It takes knowledge and training to be able to properly identify what's wrong. It takes a lot of time and work and effort, just like a muscle. You need to build it over time. You can't just one day have better mental health. It takes a lot of years, and it has to be something that you have to talk to a professional about, really hone in on exactly what you need, and it's very individual. But the most important part, just like identifying that you have high cholesterol, is identifying it. When you do a self check and you look in and you say, like, I'm having a lot of issues. And the hardest thing to do is it takes courage to do such, and that is to ask for help, to identify, I may have a problem, I may need some help. I encourage that if you have any kind of issues and you're not sure what to do, to start to look and reach for help, because it's not going to get better on its own. It's not just going to go away. Probably going to get worse if you don't treat it. It is just as important as being physically healthy. Just some closing thoughts. The road to identifying and diagnosing and treating mental illness is a long and difficult road. The only quick bandage I can even offer, you need to know whatever you're going through, whatever you're feeling, you're not the only one going through it. It has happened to somebody else. There's other people out there that have the same feelings that you're having. Somewhere out there, somebody's able to help you. Somebody out there, somewhere, cares and is willing to help. And whatever your reaction is to this mental illness, whether it be destructive, angry, sad, pathetic, you need to know that is a normal human reaction. Normal to react to unnormal situations in unnormal ways. Your reaction is normal, and you need to know that you're going to be okay. If there's no struggle, there is no progress. Frederick Douglass.